Technology can be used for good, it can be used for evil, and then there's the gray in between. Let's talk about the documentary Coded Bias. Welcome to the Film Threat Podcast. I am Chris Gore. I hope you're having a good day in light of everything that 2020 has thrown at us. It's been it feels like 3 years, but it's only been a year. But I love talking to you about films and especially documentaries. I'm kind of predisposed to love a great documentary. And this documentary, Coded Bias, I think is one of the most important docs to come out this year. I think you need to see it in a double feature with The Social Dilemma. I talked to the director of that film as well. Social Dilemma is on Netflix. Coded Bias is just coming to theaters and available for you to see. I want to introduce the director of Coded Bias, Shalini Kantayya. Good to see you.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Your documentary really blew my mind because I really feel like it talks about the gray areas of tech. Tech has solved so many problems for us, like the good tech, which in fantasy might be exemplified by R2-D2 and C-3PO. And then there's the evil tech, which might be exemplified by Terminator, right? But what you really pinpointed is this gray area, the use of technology really to identify people, which is a good thing, right? I can unlock my phone with my face. No one can steal my identity. In addition, that information can be used for nefarious purposes. What led you to making this documentary and finding the subjects that are woven into the doc, which are phenomenal spokespeople on behalf of all the issues that we're going to face?
Well, I love that you mentioned R2-D2 and the Terminator. I'm a self-proclaimed science fiction fanatic and have had a long love affair with American science fiction. And so I love technology and thinking about it and thinking about what technology could be 5 minutes into the future. And so a lot of my work focuses on how disruptive technologies impact equality, which basically means do disruptive technologies make the world more fair or less fair, and for whom? And so all of my work sort of deals with those themes in some way. And with Coded Bias, I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole of this dark underbelly of the technologies that we interact with every day. And I discovered the work of Joy Buolamwini through a TED Talk and the work of incredible scholars like Kathy O'Neill in Weapons of Math Destruction and Sophia Moja-Noble, Algorithms of Oppression, and started to realize that there was this long canon of people speaking out against big tech and its dangers. And, I didn't know I think it's important to say that I didn't know anything about algorithms when the film started. And quite often in the making of the film, I would say I couldn't go to parties because I was too worried someone would ask me what I was working on and I couldn't describe the film. I would say it's kind of about racist robots and how machines can replicate racism and sexism. And I think, quite along with the viewer, you sort of get my, I feel grateful to the brilliant and badass women in my film for giving me an education. And I hope in watching Coded Bias, you go along the same journey of discovery I did. What was so terrifying for me is to really understand that these technologies that we just have implicit trust in, if you say something and a computer says something, well, you're wrong. We have outsourced our authority to machines, that those machines can be racially biased, they can be gender biased, they can replicate anti-Semitism and historical inequalities from the past. And often they're not even vetted for accuracy or for what kind of unintended harm they could cause. And yet we have implicit faith in them. And that sort of was the wake-up call that became Coded Bias.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. It reminds me of Jeff Goldblum's character in The Fly when he basically said computers are dumb, they only know what you tell them, right? And I
Mhm.
think almost as simple as, especially Joy's story is incredibly impactful. Opening the film, she's
Mhm.
just trying to use, she's a young Black woman just trying to use facial recognition software, and it doesn't recognize her, you know, unless she puts on a white mask. It's really striking when she demonstrates it.
It's
Um,
so incredible, and I'm not sure if I could, as powerful as that moment is in the film, I have to say I stood next to Joy, when um, in the use of facial recognition technology, and seeing the camera read my face and not read hers, and understanding that when the Constitution was signed, Black citizens were only 3/5 of a human being. And
mhm.
somehow that this computer is not recognizing Joy's face as a human face, right? As a face at all, was so viscerally upsetting in a way that I'm not sure cinema could ever capture. And and so you see what is so terrifying about that moment is that Joy's groundbreaking research in gender shades proved that facial recognition that was commercially available was racially biased and gender biased, and actually biased by age. It works better on older people than on younger people. And so what is so crazy about that is that this technology was not sitting on a shelf in some laboratory somewhere. This
Right.
is technology that is being sold to the FBI, being sold to ICE, actively deployed, often in secret, by US police departments across the country, often with no one in an elected office giving any kind of oversight to how these technologies are used, and often target the communities that it's mostly racially biased against. And
Yeah.
so it becomes this sort of weaponization of technology um, that has real dangers and consequences for civil rights.
Well, I think it's definitely, and I think a simple way of putting it is when people designed buildings back in the day,
Mhm.
they always designed them with stairs. They didn't design them with people who had disabilities in mind. And now we've retrofitted buildings so that they're, I have a very good friend, Jenny Gold. She's a filmmaker. She's in a wheelchair. And, I always think about her when I think like, hey, this is not a place that's accessible to her. Now we've changed in that regard. And I feel like this is also an area that has to be upgraded. There's a really compelling part where there's I believe it's in London, correct me if I'm wrong, where there are a group of people and you see how people are being misidentified with
Mhm.
the facial recognition software. This is not 100%. And there are just so many amazing things that you have brought to light with this. I would say that a lot of this is probably due to the lazy product managers that don't have a diverse enough group of people to be engaged in designing these products, right? There are benefits to having opinions of so many people involved so that this can be just at least more equitable in its design.
Absolutely. I think there's a few problems here. I think like what you're saying is absolutely right. There's a moment in Coded Bias where you see a 14-year-old child in school uniform um, who is stopped and frisked by 5 plainclothes British metropolitan police officers, and does not even understand why he's been stopped. And to see a 14-year-old child be subject to racially biased technology at the hands of power law enforcement that has real consequences, and not even understanding, a human rights observer has to explain to him what's just happened. A similar thing happened in Detroit. In the US, I think it's important to say that I had to go to the UK to get that information because there are laws in Europe that govern data rights. And we live in a lawless society that's a wild, wild west. And so police departments across the US may be using this technology in secret. And we have documentation of the first Detroit man who was arrested in front of his family and his neighbors, held in a cell for 30 hours, the kind of stuff you don't recover from. and never asked for his license because the facial recognition technology had misidentified him. And Big Brother watch stories have shown how rampant misidentifications are of civil society. And so what I learned in the making of this film is that in terms of racial bias, we all have bias. We all have implicit bias, unconscious bias. And so, what I've learned is that inclusion of people, not just of color and not just women and not just queer people, but people of different socioeconomic backgrounds and life experiences, it just isn't good for the pictures, the sort of the cherry on top of the pictures, but it actually makes us more competitive in the industries of the future, particularly the ones that are deployed on all of us at scale. But even if we made a technology that was perfect, and I don't believe that we could, to be quite honest, from the research I've conducted, but if we could, to me, that still would not be solving the problem, because we still have issues around ethics and abuse and what happens if these technologies are used in the wrong hands. And we don't yet have any kind of legislation to protect us from what could be, sort of bad players. And so we have to look at that bias is one issue. And then I think also just sort of the larger ethics and technology is another.
Well, it's interesting. There's another segment. I mean, there's so many great, I feel like each of your segments of the doc could be their own doc or spin off into a series. It's so compelling. But there's one where you show a young woman in China, and she's basically she thinks that facial recognition is cool. Like, this is how you pay for things. This is how you go through society. It's like this is something that they've just accepted it. And I feel like in so many ways we're basically, I feel like Big Brother, we were afraid of Big Brother. And I feel like Little Brother is actually a thing that's been a good thing, right? Our cell phones. Our cell phones have exposed a lot of ills in society.
Mm-hmm.
But this is just people just accepting it, right? Like I feel like that all of those things need to be tempered, and you bring to light so many issues that in particular I found really compelling. And I do have to say, I watched your film twice. It's beautiful. So your cinematography was don't always get to say that about a documentary, but it really looks beautiful. So
thank you. That's my longtime collaborator, Steve Acevedo, a really amazing DP that I've been lucky to work with.
Well, that's a whole other conversation about lighting Black actors in movies has been something that's come to light, where when you have Black cinematographers, they tend to light Black people better, right? That's so the doc brings up so many amazing issues. One thing I also found inspiring was this group, and I watched the movie a while back, so I'm trying to remember the name. It was a group of women who get together and they talk about issues in tech, and they had a name for themselves. And now I'm spacing.
The Algorithmic Justice League.
The Algorithmic Justice League. That's
Joy's
right.
organization. That's right.
Yeah, that was so incredible, because just hearing those issues. And I've seen TED Talks by many of the, Amy Webb being a personal favorite of mine. She wrote an algorithm to find her husband. So that was, I don't know if you've ever seen that TED Talk.
No, I've not seen it. Oh, I think I have. I didn't know Amy. I didn't connect those two things, but yes.
That was Amy Webb. She wrote this, her own, based on her own set of criteria. So it's all her, but it ended up, this dating algorithm helped her find her husband. She's in the documentary. I feel like maybe that Justice League could be its own other spin-off film. But what are the takeaways? I'm curious. The film, it screened at Sundance, am I correct?
That's right.
And the reaction there, how did people respond? Because it just brings up a wealth of issues that we're going to be grappling with for the next, for decades.
Well, I was really grateful to premiere the film at Sundance, especially because it was like the last live festival. So I had the joy of seeing the film with an audience, which is like the great joy of being a filmmaker, is seeing your work with a live audience. And I sincerely hope to do that again. But, I have to say that the response was warm, and it was warm from people in the technology industry, which is something I didn't expect. I had people who worked at Google. I had someone on the team that made Tay, that sort of chatbot that becomes racist and anti-Semitic and sort of a monster of sorts. And they came up to me afterwards and said, "This is an incredible film. We've been having this conversation as an industry, and you made it a conversation that we can have with the public." And I thought that was sort of high praise for the film. I do think that the reception of the film has changed in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the largest sort of movement for civil rights and equality that we've seen for 50 years. And I'm so proud that Coded Bias is often screened within the framework of human rights and celebrating the inherent value of human beings, because sometimes that is in direct opposition to automation and efficiency. And it's really my hope that it will, do the work that Kathy O'Neill started by helping us to question this blind faith that we have in big data, and actually pushing for some legislation that would guarantee citizens some rights. Because I think the thing that I'm most concerned about is that everything we love, I mean, it would have been easy. You said like each film, there's so many films within the film. I think it would have been very easy for me to make a facial recognition film. And facial recognition is sort of the most visceral way that we can understand how algorithms work. But what I realized is that algorithms, AI, technology is going to transform everything we care about as citizens of democracy, and every civil right that we fought for in the last 50 years. Access to education, who gets healthcare, who gets hired, how long a prison sentence someone serves, what line of credit someone gets. This is more and more being automated by systems that have become these sort of automated gatekeepers of human opportunity, and sometimes without a human in place. And I think that should all be a wake-up call to us, that we need some guardrails in place to make sure that these systems are fair, to make sure that there's a system in place where we can identify when the machine has made an error, and that there's some recourse for that error. And that was really difficult. And even in the making of the film, it's so hard to find people who can identify that they've been a sort of had algorithmic bias, that they've been a victim of algorithmic bias. And I relied heavily on the researchers of my film to find a teacher who had won every award for teaching. And if you ever meet him, he'll make you tear up. He's such a dedicated teacher. But yet an arbitrary algorithm said he's a bad teacher. And yet we trust these systems like they're magic, that they know something we won't. But when you think about it, what kind of data would we use to decide if a teacher is a good teacher? Would we look at test scores? Is that really what we're valuing in education? And so I've started to even question in a lot of these systems, does it need an AI solution, or does it actually need a human one? And I find in many situations that it actually would be better if we want a society that is based on universal human rights, the idea that the inherent value of humans is what our society should be based upon, then sometimes we need to actually gut efficiency and automation.
Well, it's such a remarkable documentary. Like I say, one of my two favorite documentaries of the year, I think a great double feature with The Social Dilemma. So because it just addresses issues that are so forward thinking. And hope that we have people in our government that even understand these issues. I find it frustrating to watch, because I'll on occasion watch a Senate subcommittee talk, and it feels like they're so disconnected from how these things really work, that I'm glad to hear from what you said earlier, that Silicon Valley is actually paying attention to itself.
It's true, but I will say I don't want to leave the tech bros alone on this stuff. Like,
okay, good.
I think one thing, when I saw Joy testify before Congress, which is captured in the film, you hear Jim Jordan, who's a very right-wing conservative Republican, say, wait a minute, 117 million Americans are in a police database that they can access without a warrant, and there's no one, an elected official, who is overseeing this. And seeing him sort of as terrified as AOC
Right.
was sort of the moment where I was like, oh, we might have legislation on this. And I will say this, I make documentaries to remind myself that everyday people can make a difference. And in every film I've made, I have seen just that. And in June, we saw sea change that we never saw possible, which is IBM said that they would get out of the facial recognition game, essentially stop researching, selling it, deploying it. Microsoft said they would stop selling it to police departments, and Amazon said they would put a 1-year pause. This happened in June. It was sea change that I never thought possible when I started making this film. And it happened both because of the groundbreaking research of Joy Buolamwini and her supporting researchers, Timnit Gebru and Deborah Raji, who are highlighted in Encoded Bias, but also from the foot soldiers in the street who are sort of making the connection between racially biased invasive surveillance technologies and protecting the inherent value of Black life. And it was because of these two things that these companies came together. And so what I feel is that we have a moonshot moment in technology where the cement is not dry yet. And we still have a chance for us, and I won't leave it to legislators because they don't do anything unless we put the heat on them, that we understand these technologies, that we empower ourselves to say, AI is not the realm of these people. I want to understand how this Google algorithm is giving me my information every day. I feel like when we start to understand the technologies we interact with, we can advocate for the change we want to see and for more ethics and humanity in our technologies.
Well, I think it's incredibly important that everyone see your film. So I know it's opening theatrically in New York. Where else can people find out?
We are thrilled to premiere the film in theaters in New York City at the Metrograph Theater, November 11, 2020. Of course, that will be a virtual cinema available nationally, and through Sloan Science on Screen, promoting science education on screen with a little bit of sex appeal, I might add. Basically, 50 cities across the country. And you can look for that information on codedbias.com/screen.
Great. Codedbias.com/screen. Shalini Kantayya, thank you so much for being on the Film Threat podcast.
Such a pleasure.
I also want to thank our sponsor, Storyblocks. Go to storyblocks.com/filmthreat. All sorts of resources for filmmakers, creators, especially documentary filmmakers, 1 million+ stock footage clips. I cannot wait to see what you do next. I hope you continue on this route and to explore so many of the topics that are in this documentary, which, as I said, I think is one of the most important of the year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.